During the late 1800s, there were a number of new innovations that would improve industry, improve urban life, and would improve life in general around the United States and eventually around the world. The first innovation we'll discuss was the use of petroleum. Petroleum was not a new find or a new creation. It had been used in the United States for a number of years, but the way we used it was about to change, which would definitely change its importance and its role in our lives. When oil was first used in the United States, it was used mainly as kerosene. It was refined from the crude oil that came out of the ground into kerosene, and the byproduct of kerosene was gasoline. At that time, there was no use for gasoline, so the byproduct, the leftover, was thrown out. Gasoline wasn't used widely until the invention of the internal combustion engine, the engine that used gasoline. With its invention, gasoline becomes much more important and will be a vital resource, a very valuable resource in the U.S. and around the globe. Steel is another innovation of this era, and again, it's not a brand new creation, but how we made steel and how effective we could make it, how strong we could make it changed. Steel is made from iron, and iron has a couple very important weaknesses. Even though it's strong, it's extremely heavy, so it's not easy to use iron for a lot of applications. It's also brittle, meaning if it's put under a lot of pressure, it will break, and it corrodes or rusts more quickly over time. The Bessemer process, which came from Europe, removes impurities from iron, and that becomes steel. That purified iron becomes steel. This is a method that had been used before, not the Bessemer process, but the method of creating steel. The Bessemer process is important because it makes creating steel more cost efficient. It's a lot cheaper to create steel, and it happens much more quickly. Steel will be an extremely important material in the United States because we're able to produce it extremely quickly and relatively cheaply, so it becomes the number one building material for the railroads, for urban areas all around the United States. There's a number of ways that steel is used in the late 1800s and into the 1900s. Railroads use it to replace those old rickety wooden bridges. A lot of the wooden bridges that were created on the Transcontinental Railroad are replaced. Steel bridges are a lot stronger, much more durable. They'll last a lot longer, so they don't have to be replaced as frequently. Steel is used to create barbed wire, which we saw changed the Great Plains and eliminated the open range on the Great Plains. It's used to create bridges. The Brooklyn Bridge is the very first bridge ever made anywhere in the world that uses steel cables. The use of steel allows bridges to span greater lengths and to be built a lot larger. Same with skyscrapers. Steel allows skyscrapers to be built much higher. Theoretically, there's limitless heights with steel. Beforehand, skyscrapers had a limited height. You could only build as high as the walls would allow, as concrete or brick walls would allow. But with steel, skyscrapers can be built much, much higher. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we're going to see the development of skyscrapers in urban areas like New York and Chicago. We also see the innovation of electricity in the late 1800s by mainly Thomas Alva Edison. He's the one that's given a lot of credit. He was not the only one looking for uses of electricity. There were a number of scientists, a number of researchers trying to create an effective light bulb, but Edison's the one that's most associated with it because his worked. Edison had a research lab in Menlo Park, New Jersey. He had a lot of other scientists, other researchers working for him. And again, his main goal was to create an incandescent light bulb, a light bulb that would burn not too hot, not too brightly, and that would allow it to burn long enough. Edison reportedly tested over 1,000 different elements in his light bulbs before he eventually found the one that worked, which was carbon pounded into a very, very fine sheet. Once the light bulb was created, it didn't mean that suddenly everybody could use light bulbs. We had to get electricity to people. So one of Edison's other great accomplishments was establishing power plants all over the United States, first along the East Coast, and actually supplying power first to cities and then eventually to every corner of the United States. Electricity could be used for a lot of things at this time. It powered machinery in power plants or in industrial plants. That's important because now workers don't work just during the day. They can work all hours because the machinery is powered and there is light available, safe light. Electricity was used to power streetcars, so transportation within cities improves, and it allows people to not be tied to the place they work. You don't have to live right next door or within a short walk of where you work. You can live in a suburb and commute using powered machinery, using those streetcars to get to where you work. Other innovations that happened during this time, Christopher Sholes invents the typewriter, which would create a number of jobs, especially for women. Actually, a lot of the typewriter jobs early on hired males, but in the near future, those jobs will be filled largely by women. So additional work created for women. Alexander Graham Bell is given credit for inventing the telephone. Reportedly, the first message ever sent was to his partner who helped him invent the telephone, Thomas Watson. The first telephone message ever transmitted was, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you." And the sewing machine, which might not seem like an all-important innovation, but it changed how people purchase clothing. In the past, you either had to sew and create your clothing on your own, or if you were wealthy enough, pay a tailor to create clothing for you. Sewing machines allowed for clothes to be mass-produced and eventually mass-produced in a few sizes. So now all you had to do was find your size, and you could order or buy pre-made clothing. It made clothing much less expensive and more widely available to everyone. There are both some upsides, some downsides, some positives and negatives to these innovations. A number of them make jobs easier. Jobs become much more focused. Rather than creating an item from beginning to end, workers start as part of the process. They create one piece of the final product. That could be a good thing. It could also be a very bad thing, which we'll get to in a moment. Women had more options for work. Inventions like the typewriter and the sewing machine created more working opportunities for women. And with easier jobs and more people available to work, there's more free time. People don't work as long, so there's more free time available, more leisure time. We start to see the beginning of some leisure activities in the United States. There are some downsides, though. There's a lot less job security. If your job's easy, if all you do is pull one lever or push one button, you are very easily replaced. So workers have to be a little bit scared that if they're not doing their job, if they miss a day of work, they could be replaced. During this time period, there's not a lot of calling in sick, because if you called in sick, you might not have a job the next day. There's less pride in the work that's done. Again, if you're only part of that process, there's not as much pride as if you create the entire item from scratch. And workers lose a lot of power in the workplace. The owners of the business have all the power now because they can replace workers very easily. They can also pay them very little. A little extra about Thomas Edison. Edison was a very well-known man at this time, a very interesting man, and a very accomplished inventor. In his lifetime, Edison had 1,093 patents. A lot of those were for those light bulbs that he was creating. He created the phonograph, early record-playing device. He created the kinetoscope, which you can see on the bottom right. It was kind of the first moving picture, the first movie. He also had some very unique, very sometimes odd creations. He created the first talking doll. The doll had a little wax disc inside of it, and it worked kind of like a mini record player. The problem was the wax discs wore out eventually, and the metal needle from the player would scratch on the metal plate that the wax disc was supposed to go on, and the older dolls ended up not saying or doing anything. They screeched when metal played on metal. Edison had some failed inventions. He tried to create an entire business of pre-made concrete homes. The problem was they were really, really expensive, and someone who could afford one of Edison's concrete homes could much more easily build a very large home out of brick and wood. That may have been because Edison owned the largest concrete plant in the United States, and he was looking for ways to use some of his concrete. He actually provided most of the concrete, or rather his business provided most of the concrete for the Panama Canal.